Hi guys, it's Jessica, and today we are going to be talking about knitting in the classroom. As of right now, I've only heard of people talking about the stress relief implications that knitting has on students, and that's not what I'm going to focus on today. I have tested that myself in the past few months as I've been learning to knit. And I did find that knitting was beneficial for relieving stress, but at the same time it wasn't. And by that I mean that there's a huge learning curve that comes with knitting. At the beginning it's very, very stressful, and I found that it was actually causing me more stress than it was helping. Just because every time you lose a stitch, or a knit, and every time you make a mistake, and there's so many things that can go wrong in knitting. Every time that would happen, I would get so stressed out, and it just wasn't great. But as soon as I learned how to knit properly and I got the hang of it, everything started to go faster. I was then able to knit without putting too much thought into it, apart from thinking about my pattern. I found that once I got the hang of it and I could start going faster, then it became more of a stress relief. I'm not going to talk about its implications in the classroom as much today as I am about how you could use knitting to talk about other content. So, the first way that I would suggest talking about knitting in your classroom is if you are, let's say, a history teacher and you are talking about ancient Egypt. This is the perfect time to talk about knitting, and you might be asking why, just because it seems like they don't have anything in common. Well, let me tell you. So, the first knitted item is actually a pair of socks that was found in ancient Egypt during the 11th century. They didn't look anything like the socks that we have today. I will show you. I'm working on a PowerPoint for my class presentation right now. This is what they look like. They're kind of like little lobster claws here. I'm just putting it on a sphinx. But yeah, that was the oldest knitted piece. And now, I know you probably couldn't create an entire lesson revolving around this, but it would be an interesting time just to bring up that knitting has existed for a really long time, which actually comes into our second topic that you could use to discuss knitting. So knitting was originally in Europe before it came to North America. It didn't originate in Europe, but that's just where I'm starting this story. The Europeans, when they came over to North America, they brought knitting with them. This was pretty revolutionary because before knitting existed, the Europeans were stuck to using looms and other such items that were way bulkier, and it was hard for them to travel with these items. With the invention of knitting, they were able to actually bring their materials with them and travel with them, which could not have existed before. And this allowed the Europeans to bring knitting to North America because it was light. They could just put it in their suitcases. All you really need are 2 needles and a ball of yarn. Even then, you don't even need needles, which I'll discuss later on. You could use so many other things, including your fingers. So after they came to North America, and we all know with colonization, the Europeans came in and communicated with the First Nations, and that ensued a lot of terrible, horrible things. But one thing that was benefited from this contact was knitting. The Europeans knitting to the First Nations, and a group called, I'm probably going to butcher this, so I apologize in advance, Cohesion. So the Cohesion First Nations adopted knitting, and they became well known for their Cohesion knit sweaters. And to me, they actually took knitting and made it better than what I could have even imagined it to be. And I'm just going to show you an example again on my PowerPoint here. This is a sweater that this woman is knitting. It looks as if she's using multiple needles, which I find interesting because, I mean, I'm very new to knitting and I've never even thought about using more than just your normal 2 needles. Not entirely sure how that's working out. I have a feeling it's similar to a round needle, the ones that have a connected string to them. But anyhow, the intricacy of the pattern that this woman is using is just beyond my comprehension. I have no idea how she's doing it. It just shows that knitting is something that a lot of people look at as being basic and boring, but so much more than that. And so I found that really interesting to learn that the Cowichan First Nations group did turn it into completely different. And so this could be an interesting point for teachers to start talking about First Nations, and you could even exhibit other knit work that they use, and you could try to implement it in your classroom through teaching your students how to knit. And knitting is something that is so personal. It's not like all of our post-industrialization clothing. So for example, right now I'm wearing a knitted sweater, but it has no meaning to me because it was created in a factory somewhere by a machine. It's not special. However, when you knit something, it takes so much time and so much out of you that it becomes special. It becomes, there's like a feeling attached to it. And so I think that's something that you could talk about in your classroom through the lens. On to math. If you are teaching a math lesson on patterning, this would be a good time to introduce knitting as well, because knitting actually reuses a lot of patterns no matter what type of garment you are creating. So when I was learning to knit, I got this book. It's called Learning to Knit by Leisure Arts. And there's some patterns in here that are very basic for beginners, so I'll show you. So this is the one that I used for when I was making my baby blanket. Mine's a little bit different just because mine is a little bit more rectangular than this is, but it's the same general idea. You have purls bordering and then knits on the inside. And this is something that's actually, it looks very simple, but in theory it actually takes a lot of thought and a lot of attention to create a pattern such as that. And then you move on to a pattern like this. This is one I have not yet tried. It says that it is for beginners, but I have not tried it. I have no idea how the process is making a pattern such as that, but it is very interesting. Here's another example. Again, I haven't tried this one yet. I'm still very much a beginner, but this is something that could be interesting to explore with your students once they get the hang of knitting. There's all sorts of patterns, and you could have students pick their own pattern and try it out. It's very different than the traditional cookie cutter lessons you find in math classes. A lot of teachers use blocks and they use paper, and that's fine because it's quick and easy to do, and sometimes you don't have time in your curriculum to spend on longer lessons. But if you do find that you have a little bit time and you could spend it on making the lesson a little bit more authentic and unique, I think that knitting would be a great way to do that in a math classroom. Last but not least, here in Quebec we have a program called ERC, and that program is used for a variety of different things, but one of them is also for teaching students about empathy, and empathy can be taught through knitting. And you might be asking how? Well, during the holiday season, or even through Thanksgiving, depending on if your school is predominantly religious in a Catholic, Christian kind of sense or not. You have to be mindful of your students, but during the holiday season or Thanksgiving, you could teach about empathy through knitting. And this can be done by exploring giving to those less fortunate. You could do a whole introduction unit, or lesson I mean, on the importance of giving and thinking of others and putting their needs before your own and giving without the expectation of receiving. As a follow-up, you could teach your students how to knit, and you could have each student create a 20 by 20 little patch of knitting. They could all pick a different pattern if you want to tie it into the patterning in math. And after all of the students have their little patch, you as the teacher could take these pieces, sew them all together, and create one big blanket. And with your class blanket, you could give it to somebody who is in need. I'm in Montreal right now, and Montreal winters are absolutely horrible. They're very cold. There's definitely a lot of people in Montreal who are in need of warm clothing and warm blankets during the winter season. So this would be a fantastic time to give your classroom blanket to somebody who is in need. This is a very authentic way of teaching your students about giving without the expectation of receiving, because it does take so much work. It's a labor of love, and in this case it's a labor of love for people that, or somebody that they don't even know, and that's really meaningful. It's a meaningful experience to learn, simply because they don't have any personal attachment to this person, but they are still willing to put so much effort into making something for them. Anyway, might be rambling on here a little bit, so I'm going to continue. So now I'm going to be talking about knitting in a classroom and what the logistics of this are. As I mentioned previously, there are alternatives to knitting needles that you can use in a classroom just to save on your budget. Some people I've seen online have used their fingers. There's lots of tutorials you can find on YouTube. I've personally never tried this before, so I'm not really an expert on knitting with your fingers, but that is something that you can do in lieu of needles, and that costs absolutely nothing for using your fingers. Alternatively to that, what I've kind of thought about using whenever I have my own classroom are pencil crayons. You could use pencils, however pencils have graphite or lead in them, and this could get onto the yarn and make a mess, so that's why I'm just suggesting pencil crayons. So you take pencil crayons and you put those big thick erasers on the end of each one, and then you have 2 knitting needles, and you can just knit normally with them from that point on. Another thing that I would suggest using is bigger yarn. So when I was learning to knit, I used tiny little yarn, and every time I would try to knit, it would kind of unravel or fall off, and I lost so many stitches. There'll be a video up as well of my learning to knit, and you can go watch that disaster unfold. But I would suggest using a bigger yarn. I used Bernay baby blanket yarn when I was making my baby blanket for my nephew. This I found to be so much more useful when I was learning, just because I am new to knitting. I've never knit before I started this project for my class. Using bigger yarn helps you see the pattern faster. It helps you see the stitches and the purls and the difference between the two, and it helps you just get through the process of learning to knit a little bit smoother, because the yarn is bigger, your needles are bigger, it's easier to see what you're doing. If you lose a stitch, it's easier to find it, and I just really using bigger yarn. But yarn can be very costly, so I would also suggest asking parent volunteers to donate yarn to your classroom. I wouldn't suggest making it a requirement, just because it can be pretty costly, and for some families that aren't able to spend on yarn, it's just not really fair to make it a requirement. So I would have, you could ask your community, you could ask parents, you could ask staff members to donate on their own terms. I would also suggest asking parents or grandparents or community members to come in and help when you are doing your tutorial with your class on how to knit. You could use YouTube videos, but I would also suggest having some extra eyes and extra hands, just because it can be quite frustrating in the creation process, or the learning process, if you will. As I mentioned before, there is such a big learning curve, and at the beginning it is so frustrating to keep messing up and to lose your stitches and you don't know how to get them back, and there's just so many different things you're learning, so many movements that are new to you, and so I think that having the extra eyes and hands could really help eliminate the frustrations that I had during my learning process. And that's all I can really think of for now. If I think of anything else, I'll make a part 2 to this video. If you have any suggestions for other lessons you could use knitting for, please leave them in the comments below. If you've tried any of these ideas in your classroom, let me know how they went, and I would love the feedback just because I will be a teacher starting next year, and so it'd be really great to know, so that way I can start altering things for when I start teaching. And if you have any other ideas for what you would like me to talk about or create or try to create, please also leave those in the comments down below. I love feedback, and yeah, so please keep it PG because I'm sure there will be lots of future students watching this. And thank you for your time. Have a good day. Bye.